The breaking point. The galaxy had never feared the Deathworlders. They had always been seen as primitive, brutal beings from a harsh, untamed world. For centuries, they had been underestimating the Deathworlders, treating them as if they were mere animals, too savage to think beyond their rage. But they were wrong. The Deathworlders had been patient. They had stayed silent as other alien races mocked them, attacked their colonies, and desecrated their lands. But that patience was running out. It started with a small incident. A few ships from the Yeerk fleet, an alien race known for their cruelty and greed, had crossed into Deathworlder space. It wasn't a large invasion, just a small scouting mission. But it was enough. The Yeerk had been harassing Deathworlder settlers for years, taking their resources and leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The Deathworlders had let it slide. They had been silent, keeping their distance and hoping that diplomacy would work. They had been wrong to think that. The Yeerk ships ventured deep into Deathworlder territory, unaware of the silent warriors waiting for them. As the Yeerk ships entered a small, isolated system, the Deathworlders struck without warning. A dozen sleek, heavily armed ships emerged from the shadows of a nearby asteroid belt. The Yeerk had no time to react. The first blast from the Deathworlders' weapons destroyed the lid ship in a flash of light. It was a brutal, swift attack. The remaining Yeerk ships tried to retaliate, but they were no match for the Deathworlders' advanced technology and ruthless tactics. Within minutes, every ship in the Yeerk fleet was destroyed. But the Deathworlders didn't stop there. They didn't simply leave the wreckage behind. No, they sent a clear message. They didn't just destroy the Yeerk ships. They obliterated them, reducing them to smoldering pieces of debris. The message was simple: no more mercy. As the last Yeerk ship was turned to ash, the leader of the Deathworlder fleet, a fierce and battle-hardened warrior named Varric, broadcasted a message to the entire galaxy. His voice was cold, filled with fury, but steady. "This is a warning," he said. "We have been patient, but you have made the mistake of thinking we are weak. The galaxy has underestimated the Deathworlders for far too long. We will not wait any longer. No mercy, no games, only retribution." The message spread quickly across the galaxy, sending shockwaves through every corner of known space. The alien races, many of whom had grown accustomed to mocking the Deathworlders, suddenly felt a shiver run down their spines. The words of Varric echoed in their minds: no mercy, no games, only retribution. For the first time in centuries, the Deathworlders had shown their true strength, and it was a strength that the galaxy was not prepared for. In the days that followed, a sense of fear began to grow across the galaxy. Planets that had once laughed at the Deathworlders' supposed barbarism now feared their vengeance. The Yeerk weren't the only ones who had been a thorn in the side of the Deathworlders. Other races had exploited their kindness and their patience, thinking they could take advantage of their silence. But now, the Deathworlders were no longer silent. As news of the attack spread, the galaxy began to brace itself. Trade routes were shut down. Military fleets were mobilized. The larger, more powerful alien empires started to prepare for what they knew was coming. They had seen what the Deathworlders were capable of in battle, and they knew they weren't just dealing with a simple war. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting for territory or resources. This wasn't about expanding their empire or gaining power. It was something much deeper. They were fighting for something that had been taken from them. They were fighting for their dignity, their honor. They were fighting because they had been pushed too far. The galaxy watched as Varric and his warriors began their campaign. The first targets were those who had aided the Yeerk in their raids. Entire cities vanished overnight, destroyed by the might of the Deathworlder fleets. The Deathworlders moved quickly, decisively. There were no negotiations, no talks. They didn't care about diplomacy or peace. They cared only about vengeance. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. For years, the Deathworlders had been underestimated, ignored, and mistreated. But now, They were showing the galaxy what it meant to face the fury of a people who had finally snapped. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Who would be next? The Deathworlders had made their point clear. They weren't to be taken lightly anymore. And as their ships moved from one planet to the next, the galaxy began to realize the true scale of the storm that had just been unleashed. And this was only the beginning. The consequences of wrath. The galaxy had never known a threat like the one now hanging over them. The Deathworlders' fury had just begun, and the entire universe was on the edge of its seat. It wasn't just a show of force. It was a declaration of war, a warning that no one could afford to ignore. As the days passed, panic spread like wildfire through the Galactic Council and the vast network of interstellar governments. No one had anticipated such a relentless attack from a race once considered too primitive, too wild to be taken seriously. The leaders of the galaxy's most powerful races scrambled to assess the damage. The York, having suffered the first and most devastating blow, were now reeling. Their fleets had been destroyed in mere hours. Whole planets in their territory had been reduced to rubble. They tried to reach out to the other alien empires, begging for help, but their calls went unanswered. The Deathworlders were already on the move. There would be no more negotiations, no more pleading. The rules had changed. The Zonians, a technologically advanced race with a reputation for diplomacy, were the next target. For centuries, they had seen themselves as neutral players in the galaxy, trying to maintain peace between the various factions. But the Deathworlders didn't care about diplomacy. They didn't care about peace. To them, the Zonians had been complicit in the endless cycle of exploitation and oppression. They had turned a blind eye when the Deathworlders were wronged, when their colonies were attacked, when their people were murdered. It was time to make them pay. Within hours of Varric's message, the Zonians found themselves under attack. Their great fleets, once thought unbeatable, were torn apart by the speed and power of the Deathworlder assault. The Deathworlders used their unmatched tactics, hit-and-run attacks, decoys, and overwhelming firepower, leaving the Zonians scrambling to mount a defense. They had never faced an enemy like this before. News of the Zonians' failure spread quickly, and soon the once proud Zonians were begging for mercy, offering to give up anything they could to stop the destruction. But the Deathworlders had made it clear that there would be no more mercy, no more games, only retribution. Their message was brutal and final. You all had your chance. Now, feel the price of your betrayal. The other empires of the galaxy watched in horror as the Deathworlders tore through their enemies. One by one, they saw their allies fall, and soon it became clear that no one was safe. Even the most powerful forces in the galaxy were vulnerable. No longer could the galaxy rest easy, thinking that the Deathworlders were just savage creatures from a far-off, dangerous world. Now, they were a force to be reckoned with. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the Deathworlders, a force of nature, unstoppable and unforgiving. On the other stood a galaxy in disarray, its leaders unsure of what to do next. They had miscalculated. They had taken too long to act. And now, it was too late. The first steps toward retaliation were clumsy, desperate. The Galactic Council called for a united front. But even the might of the Varkian Empire, known for their warships the size of moons, could not match the ferocity of the Deathworlders. The Varkians mobilized their fleets, prepared to fight, but they knew this war would be different. It wasn't going to be a battle of tactics. It was going to be a battle of survival. Elsewhere, leaders of the Ashta, a race known for their powerful psychic abilities, began to make plans. They would attempt to infiltrate the Deathworlders' minds, to find some way to stop the onslaught. But the Deathworlders weren't just warriors. They were survivors. They knew how to fight, how to withstand anything thrown their way. They had lived through the harshest environments the galaxy had ever known. Nothing could break them. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting to conquer. They were fighting to make sure the galaxy would never forget who they were. They wanted their enemies to remember the power of a people who had been pushed to the edge and finally snapped. Varric, standing at the helm of the Deathworlder flagship, looked out at the stars, knowing the next phase of their vengeance was about to begin. He had led them to this point, but the true cost of their wrath was yet to be seen. He knew the galaxy would retaliate. Somehow, they would try to fight back. But he also knew that the Deathworlders had the strength to crush anyone who stood in their way. A galaxy-wide tremor spread through the universe as each empire struggled to decide what they would do next. Would they stand and fight, or would they bow to the fury of the Deathworlders? The tension was unbearable, the silence deafening. As the Deathworlders' fleets spread like a shadow across the galaxy, the question remained on everyone's lips. Who would be next? And in the hearts of the Deathworlders, one truth echoed louder than any words could. They would not stop, not until the galaxy had learned to fear them. The galaxy responds. The chaos that followed the Deathworlders' attack sent shockwaves across the galaxy. The leaders of every major empire and faction realized, too late, that they had underestimated their enemy. For centuries, the Deathworlders had been seen as nothing more than a footnote in the annals of galactic history, primitive, savage, and wild. Yet now, the entire galaxy was on the edge of collapse, and it was the Deathworlders who stood at the center of it all. The Galactic Council, made up of the most powerful alien races, immediately called an emergency meeting. Leaders and commanders from the Varkian Empire, the Zonians, the Ashta, and countless other factions gathered in the council chambers, trying to form a plan of action. The destruction caused by the Deathworlders was unprecedented, and no one knew how to respond. They had been caught off guard. And now, they had to decide if they could stop the relentless wave of fury that was sweeping across the stars. "It's clear," said Varric of the Varkian Empire, his voice cold and calm, yet filled with a sense of urgency. "We cannot defeat them through conventional means. They are too powerful, too unpredictable." Beside him, the representative from the Ashta, a race of psychic beings, shifted uneasily. "We cannot use our psychic abilities to stop them," the Ashta leader said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Their minds are shielded. They've prepared for this." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. What had once seemed like an impossible, far-off threat was now at their doorstep. The Deathworlders were unstoppable, and if they didn't act quickly, the galaxy would be torn apart. "I suggest we offer them a truce," said a representative from the Zonians. "We have the power to negotiate peace. Surely they must be willing to listen." But that suggestion was met with harsh silence. The York, having suffered the most devastating loss, were already preparing to retreat to their outer systems. Their leader, a grim-looking alien with dark, weathered skin, turned to the council and gave a single dismissive shake of his head. "Truce." He spat. "Do you think the Deathworlders want peace? They are beyond peace. They want vengeance." Varric's voice was quiet, but his words struck like a hammer. "They will not stop until they have wiped out every last one of you." Despite the panic that spread throughout the council, some leaders still held out hope. They argued for diplomacy, for negotiations. But as each race tried to make its case, the reality of the situation became clearer. The Deathworlders weren't interested in talks. They weren't interested in compromise. They were fighting for something far deeper, something that would not be easily sated. In the quiet of his war room, Varric stood in front of the holographic map of the galaxy, watching as the Deathworlder fleet moved from one system to the next. The galaxy was watching them, waiting for a sign of weakness. But Varric knew better. There would be no weakness. The galaxy had pushed the Deathworlders too far. Now, they were paying the price. "Prepare for the next wave," Varric said, his voice steady but laced with the same cold fury that had driven him to this point. "We have only just begun." As the Deathworlders prepared to strike again, the galaxy remained divided. Some factions continued to resist, clinging to hope that somehow they could stop the oncoming storm. But others were already surrendering. They saw no future in standing against the Deathworlders' wrath. In the aftermath of their first wave, entire planets had been wiped out. The leaders of the Galactic Council knew they had no choice but to fight, but they also knew that this was no ordinary war. This wasn't about territory. It wasn't about power. This was about survival. And as the Deathworlders' fleets moved closer to the next target, the question remained, how long before the galaxy realizes that fighting them may be a futile effort? The Deathworlders, though few in number, were united by something far stronger than fear. They were united by their need for vengeance, by the deep scars that the galaxy had left on them. And now, the galaxy would learn the true meaning of retribution. Varric stood at the front of his flagship, looking out into the vast expanse of space. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He wasn't looking for peace. He wasn't looking for compromise. What he sought was something that could only be won in the heat of battle. Retribution. And the galaxy was about to learn the true cost of underestimating the Deathworlders. The galaxy's desperation. As the Deathworlders continued their march of destruction, the entire galaxy was plunged into a state of chaos and fear. Leaders scrambled to respond, knowing that each moment of hesitation was another step toward total annihilation. Every system, every race, every government knew that the next strike could be their last. The Deathworlders were no longer a myth. They were a terrifying reality. And no one was safe. The response from the galactic factions was fractured. The once unified council now stood divided, with different factions offering different solutions. Some insisted on diplomacy, even as the Deathworlders tore through their allies' worlds. Others were calling for an all-out war, but their fleets were scattered, disorganized, and ill-prepared for what was coming. The York, having been the first to feel the wrath of the Deathworlders, were already beginning to retreat to their distant outer territories. Their fleet, once proud and powerful, had been destroyed in hours. Entire cities on their homeworld were reduced to rubble. The loss of so many York warriors had sent shockwaves through their entire civilization. They weren't just losing territory. They were losing their identity, their very way of life. "They won't stop until we are all gone," said the York High Commander, his voice full of resignation. "We must retreat, regroup, and plan for the next stage. If we are to survive, we must go beyond what we've ever thought possible." While the York were withdrawing into isolation, the Ashta, the psychically powerful race, had begun their own desperate efforts. Their first tactic was to attempt an infiltration of the Deathworlders' minds. They believed that if they could break through the mental barriers surrounding the Deathworlders, they might be able to weaken them or control their thoughts. But it quickly became apparent that this would be no easy task. The Deathworlders' minds were too strong, too well protected. The leader of the Ashta, Jalar, stood at the forefront of their psychic assault. He concentrated all of his energy, reaching into the depths of the Deathworlders' psyche, searching for a way in. But each time he tried, he was repelled with a force so powerful that it left him reeling. "There is something different about them," Jalar muttered, his voice strained with effort. "It's as if their minds are shields, built not by technology, but by something primal. We can't break through." Jalar's frustration only deepened as the Deathworlders' attacks continued, their fury undeterred. There would be no mind tricks, no manipulation. These were beings of pure action, and their fury could not be silenced by mental battles. Meanwhile, the Varkian Empire, long known for their military might, began to take charge of the defense effort. They had long been rivals of the Deathworlders, but even they were taken by surprise at the sheer ferocity of the attack. The Varkians had some of the most powerful warships in the galaxy, ships that could tear through asteroids like they were paper. But facing the Deathworlders was something entirely different. The Deathworlders didn't fight like any enemy they had ever faced. The Varkian admiral, Jorak, stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring out at the fleet before him. His mind raced with calculations and strategies, but there was one thing that kept echoing through his thoughts. "This is no ordinary battle. We will fight. Admiral Jorak declared, slamming his fist onto the command console. But this is something more than war. This is a reckoning. The Varkians launched a counteroffensive, but it became quickly apparent that it was not enough. The Deathworlders' attacks were too swift, too overwhelming. Entire fleets were destroyed in moments, their ships torn apart as if they were paper. And then something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, a new force arrived in the galaxy's outer rim. A fleet, unlike any the galaxy had seen before, emerged from the darkness of space. These ships were smaller, more agile than the massive warships of the Varkians, yet they moved with incredible precision. Their technology was advanced, their weapons devastating. The fleet belonged to the Caraxi, an ancient and secretive race that had remained neutral in the galaxy's conflicts for millennia. They were known for their mysterious ways and powerful technology, but no one had ever expected them to intervene. "We have been watching," came a voice over the communications channel. The voice was calm, almost ethereal, yet there was a certain weight to it. "You are not alone in this. The Caraxi will help." The Caraxi's sudden appearance brought a glimmer of hope to the fractured galaxy. Perhaps this new alliance would be the key to turning the tide, to stopping the Deathworlders' endless wrath. But as the Caraxi ships made their move, something even darker loomed in the distance, a new, uncharted threat that would soon arrive, one that could make the Deathworlders' rage seem like a mere whisper in comparison. And so, the stage was set. The galaxy had one last chance to survive. They would either stand together or fall apart, shattered beneath the unstoppable fury of the Deathworlders. But even with new allies at their side, the galaxy could not forget the one thing that was driving the Deathworlders forward. Their vengeance was not yet sated. The battle had only just begun. The counteroffensive. The galaxy held its breath as the Deathworlders pressed onward, their fury showing no sign of slowing. The Caraxi, with their powerful, sleek ships, had been a surprising force on the battlefield, but even they were struggling to match the relentless speed and brutality of the Deathworlders. Their advanced technology was impressive, but the Deathworlders were not mere soldiers. They were predators, capable of turning the tide of any battle with sheer willpower. Admiral Jorak of the Varkian Empire, despite the initial losses, held onto one small thread of hope. The galaxy was not completely lost. The galaxy's mightiest factions were beginning to organize, with the Caraxi aiding the Varkians and the Ashta providing psychic reconnaissance. But there was one problem that no one had anticipated. The Deathworlders were evolving as they fought. "They learn as they go," Jorak muttered, watching the battle unfold on the holographic screen. "Every strike, every failure, only makes them stronger. They adapt faster than anything we've ever seen." As the Deathworlders' fleet tore through the galaxy, they seemed to be learning more about their enemies with each engagement. They were relentlessly clever, using tactics and strategies no one had ever expected. Entire fleets that had been thought to be safe were obliterated by Deathworlder warships that arrived unexpectedly, with cunning tactics that left even the Caraxi stunned. The Varkians, once the most feared warriors in the galaxy, were beginning to feel the weight of this unrelenting force. Their ships, once impervious to most enemies, were now under siege, their defenses slowly worn down by the constant, vicious strikes. Jorak knew something had to change. "Retreat," Jorak ordered, a rare command for a Varkian warrior. "Pull back to the third quadrant. We need more time to regroup." But even as the Varkian fleet began to pull back, the Deathworlders followed. Their warships were faster, and with no hesitation, they pursued, closing in with terrifying speed. One by one, Varkian ships fell, their once legendary technology unable to withstand the sheer fury of their enemies. Meanwhile, the Ashta, still reeling from their failed attempt to infiltrate the Deathworlder mines, were preparing for their next step. Their leader, Jalar, had come to a grim realization. The Deathworlders didn't fight with the same mindset as other civilizations. They didn't fight for conquest, for territory, or for glory. They fought for vengeance, and their anger was fueled by years of oppression, and that made them a force unlike any other. Jalar convened a council of Ashta warriors, his mind racing. "We cannot fight them like we fight other races," he told his people. "We need to find out what they truly want." The Ashta turned their focus inward, using their psychic abilities to dig deeper into the minds of the Deathworlders, hoping to uncover a weakness, a point of leverage. But the Deathworlders' thoughts were a maze, an impenetrable fortress that only grew more complicated with each failed attempt to understand them. Their rage was like a storm, filling every crevice of their minds, and every attempt to pierce that storm failed. "We are getting closer," Jalar said, though the weariness in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "But we need more time. We don't have much of it." The Caraxi, observing from their own ships, had taken a more subtle approach. Their race was known for its secretive nature, and though they were willing to fight, they were hesitant to engage in full-scale conflict. Instead, they sought out intelligence, probing the edges of Deathworlder space for clues. What they discovered only made things worse. "Their numbers are growing," a Caraxi commander reported. "And they are not just fighting, they are recruiting." The galaxy's most terrifying realization was coming true. The Deathworlders were not fighting for survival, they were building an army. And their reach stretched farther than anyone had anticipated. Admiral Jorak turned to the Varkian command staff, his face grim. "We cannot hold out like this forever. The Deathworlders are turning every corner of the galaxy into their battleground. We need to strike back before they recruit every last species in this galaxy." But there was a more pressing issue. The Deathworlders, despite their fury, were not invincible. Their fleets, though powerful, were not endless. The more they fought, the more they revealed cracks in their seemingly unstoppable juggernaut. The galaxy's response had been slow and disorganized, but now a plan was beginning to take shape. There was one strategy that the galaxy had overlooked, a strategy born from desperation, and born from the same relentless fury that the Deathworlders had used to tear the galaxy apart. And it was one that could only work if every faction in the galaxy united for one final effort. "The time for diplomacy is over," Admiral Jorak said, his voice steely with determination. "It's time for the galaxy to strike back. We will use their own tactics against them." The final counteroffensive was in motion. The Wrath unleashed. The galaxy's last hope hung in the balance. Every faction had put aside their differences, drawn together by the one thing they all feared: the Deathworlders. They had fought valiantly, but their numbers were dwindling. The Deathworlders, relentless and fueled by an ancient rage, had pushed them to the brink of extinction. The final counteroffensive had begun, and Admiral Jorak's Varkian fleet was at the forefront. The once feared fleet had retreated, licking its wounds, but now they had a single mission: to strike back with everything they had. Every gun, every ship, every ounce of power they could muster would be thrown into this battle. If they failed, the galaxy would fall. There would be no second chances. Jorak stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the star map as it flickered with the movements of his fleet. His mind raced, calculating, weighing risks. He had no illusions left. This was not just a battle for victory. This was a fight for survival, and every choice could mean the difference between life and death for billions of beings across the galaxy. "We must hit them at their core," Jorak ordered, voice steady but filled with urgency. "Their fleets are powerful, but they cannot sustain this relentless war forever. We strike now, or we die. There is no middle ground." The Caraxi had joined the assault with their superior speed and technology, offering their ships as both scouts and shock troops. The Ashta, still reeling from their failure to infiltrate the Deathworlders' minds, had turned to their most powerful weapon: their psychic abilities. They would launch a final, all-out attempt to tap into the Deathworlders' collective consciousness and strike at their core. "We've gathered all the information we can," Jalar, the leader of the Ashta, said. "It's time to face them, head on. The Deathworlders have one weakness: a vulnerability we've detected in their battle strategies. They rely too heavily on their rage. If we can exploit that, we might just be able to defeat them. Jalar's words struck a chord with the other commanders. The Deathworlders' fury was their strength, but also their Achilles' heel. Their inability to think beyond their primal instincts was a flaw that could be exploited. The galaxy now had a chance, the slim one, but a chance nonetheless. The counteroffensive commenced with a furious flurry of battles. The Deathworlders' ships swarmed like hornets, every strike landing with the power to wipe entire fleets from existence. Yet the galaxy's forces fought back with a fury of their own, launching wave after wave of attacks, pushing back against the seemingly unstoppable tide. One of the most decisive engagements took place in the heart of the battle. The Deathworlders, having sensed the shift in strategy, sent their largest fleet to crush the combined forces of the galaxy. It was a risk, their largest and most formidable warships, all together under one command. They thought it would be enough to wipe out the galaxy's resistance in one final, overwhelming sweep. But they had underestimated one thing: the resolve of the galaxy's united forces. Jorek's fleet was the first to engage, charging headfirst into the oncoming wave of Deathworlder ships. His warships fired on all cylinders, their heavy guns blasting into the enemy's ranks. The Caraxi ships darted in and out of the chaos, targeting key Deathworlder vessels with pinpoint precision, while the Ashta provided psychic interference, trying to destabilize the Deathworlders' coordination. The battle raged for hours, a violent dance of destruction that saw ships torn apart, explosions lighting up the void of space. The Deathworlders, however, showed no signs of slowing. Their ships were a relentless mass of destruction, charging forward with a savage intensity that seemed to know no bounds. Then, a breakthrough occurred. Jalar, the Ashta leader, had managed to focus his psychic energy on one of the Deathworlders' commanders. For a brief moment, he was able to pierce through their mental shield, flooding their mind with images of their past atrocities. The Deathworlders' rage was stirred like a hornet's nest, but it also sparked confusion. For just a moment, the storm of their thoughts was thrown into chaos. The Deathworlders hesitated. It was all the galaxy needed. The Varkian warships capitalized on the confusion, targeting the largest Deathworlder battleship at the center of the fleet. They fired everything they had, delivering a devastating barrage of firepower. The massive ship shook violently under the assault, its defenses failing in the face of the relentless attack. The Deathworlders' fleet, now thrown into disarray, began to falter. Their once cohesive formation broke apart as panic spread through their ranks. The galaxy's forces, emboldened by the opportunity, surged forward, striking relentlessly at the weakened enemy ships. But just as victory seemed within reach, another horrifying twist unfolded. From the shadows of deep space, a new fleet emerged, one even more powerful than the Deathworlders had been. It was a fleet of unknown origin, their ships unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. They arrived with brutal force, their weapons outclassing anything the galaxy had previously known. The galaxy's counteroffensive had worked, too well, perhaps. The Deathworlders had been pushed back, but the true danger had only just arrived. The galaxy was about to face a new, darker threat, one that had remained hidden for longer than anyone could have imagined. The final reckoning. The galaxy's forces had barely managed to take a breath after their victory over the Deathworlders when the new threat made itself known. The unknown fleet, sleek and menacing, had emerged from the depths of the galaxy, its weapons far beyond the capabilities of anything the galaxy had seen. It was as if they had been waiting, observing, biding their time. Now, they were here, and the galaxy's hard-fought battle was far from over. Admiral Jorek's mind raced as he watched the holographic display of the new enemy fleet. They moved with terrifying precision, as though they had been designed to crush anything in their path. Their ships were a darker shade than any known fleet, their forms angular and razor-sharp, cutting through the stars like predators hunting their prey. "They're faster than we expected," Jorek muttered, his voice tight with concern. "And their weapons, they're beyond anything we have." Jalar, the Ashta leader, stared at the incoming fleet, his mind stretched thin from the strain of psychic battles with the Deathworlders. "These are not like the Deathworlders," he said, his voice low. "This enemy, they do not fight with rage. They fight with cold calculation and their technology. It's as though they have evolved beyond us." The Ashta had always been experts in reading the minds of their enemies, but this new fleet presented an entirely different challenge. Their thoughts were cold, logical, and dispassionate. There was no emotion to manipulate, no weakness to exploit. They were simply calculating the most efficient way to destroy, and that efficiency made them terrifying. The galaxy's combined forces, already battered from the long war with the Deathworlders, were at a disadvantage. Their ships were damaged, their crews exhausted, and their morale shaken. But they had no choice but to face this new enemy head-on. The question now was not whether they could win, it was whether they could survive. "We've been pushed to the edge once before," Jorik said, his voice rising with renewed determination. "And we fought back. Now we do it again. We unite, or we die alone." The commanders of every faction, from the Caraxi to the Varkians, to the Ashta and every species in between, knew the gravity of the moment. They had faced a seemingly unstoppable force before, and they had prevailed. Now, they would have to do it again. But this time, the odds were far steeper. "Deploy the fleet," Jorik barked. "We're not going down without a fight." The first clash was brutal. The galaxy's fleet moved into position, combining their forces for a single unified strike against the mysterious enemy. Their ships, battered but determined, faced off against the sleek, cold vessels of the new enemy. The battle began with the eruption of energy blasts, the soundless explosions lighting up the void as ships were torn apart in a deadly ballet of destruction. The galaxy's fleets fought with everything they had, knowing that this was their final stand. The Deathworlders had prepared them for this moment, teaching them the value of fighting with every ounce of willpower. And now, as the enemy closed in, the galaxy's forces fought with a desperation that only came from knowing that survival was not a guarantee. But the new enemy proved to be even more formidable than anyone had anticipated. Their weapons were devastating, obliterating ships with a single strike, and their tactics were terrifyingly effective. They seemed to anticipate every move the galaxy's fleet made, countering with ruthless precision. As the battle raged on, the death toll mounted. Ships that had once been symbols of power and pride were now little more than floating wreckage. The galaxy's united forces were being pushed back, retreating under the weight of the overwhelming power of the new enemy. But there was one final card to play. Jorik, in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide, had one final weapon at his disposal. He had held it back, knowing the risks, but now there was no time to hesitate. The galaxy's fleets had to unite once more, in a single final push. The last desperate strike that could either end in victory, or the end of everything. "We charge them with everything we've got," Jorik ordered. "No mercy, no hesitation. This is the final chance we have." The united fleet surged forward, firing with every weapon they had left. It was a hail of energy, missiles, and raw power, all directed at the heart of the mysterious enemy fleet. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope. The enemy's shields faltered under the barrage, their ships beginning to break apart, but the enemy responded with terrifying force, pushing back with renewed strength. Then, just when it seemed that the galaxy's forces would be overwhelmed, a single ship appeared from the shadows of the battle, the flagship of the Deathworlders. In their rage and vengeance, they had returned. The Deathworlders, having suffered heavy losses in their pursuit of vengeance, had not disappeared. They had been waiting for their moment to strike back. With the Deathworlders' fleet joining the fray, the battle shifted once more. The galaxy's forces, already on the edge of defeat, now had one final ally, one final push. Together, the united fleet, now including the Deathworlders, launched a final, all-out assault on the mysterious enemy. The void shook with the fury of the final clash. Ships exploded, stars flickered, and the silence of space was broken by the roar of the most desperate battle the galaxy had ever seen. But when the dust finally settled, it was clear that the galaxy had survived. The new enemy had been driven back, their fleet shattered. The galaxy was not yet safe, but they had won. For now. Jorak looked out at the aftermath of the battle, his face weary but resolute. We have won, but this is only the beginning. There will be more battles ahead, and we will face them together. The galaxy had been pushed to the brink, but it had fought back with a strength that no one could have predicted. The Deathworlders, once a threat themselves, had been the galaxy's final weapon. Together, they had turned the tide. But now, they faced a future unknown.